Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and it's Tuesday, and I'm happy to be here. It was a very sunny day here in Northern California. Lovely, lovely spring day, and I was very happy with it. I'm also happy to be here with you, as always. I'm happy to be talking about books. I'm happy to be bringing you another author interview. As I mentioned at the end of the last episode, I have a returning author joining me this week, and that is our first author to return for the third time. Third time's the charm? I don't know. The author is Jason Pellegrini. Jason was actually the third author I ever interviewed on this podcast, and if you're interested in hearing his first two episodes, if you haven't heard those already, he was on the first time to talk about his novel Booth in May of 2017, and that is episode 15. He then came back in October of 2017, episode 32, to talk about his novella, The Cool Kids. So if you want to check those out, those are the episodes that you need to look for. Today we are talking about his new novella. It's called If I Could Have Lived Another Day, and the description is as follows. In 2005, Dan Brady had very little idea where his life was going. But unlike other young adults who might be more accepting that things will fall into place, Dan wasn't content with waiting around for life to just figure itself out. He needed to find his purpose, and it would be in the last place he ever thought imaginable. Dan would find everything he was looking for. The day that Dan met the woman that would one day become Tina Brady, everything had come together and fallen into place. He had finally found his purpose. Dan and Tina's love was a simple love, not filled with dramatics or defined by a big, over-the-top moment. It was their own, and therefore it was the greatest love of all. It was the one they were happy to share with one another for the rest of their lives. But unfortunately, the rest of their life together would not be the long journey they had planned it to be. At just 33 years old, Tina was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and before Dan could even process what was happening to his wife, he would have to bury her. The night after Tina's funeral, Dan would find himself lost in a grief that had no end in sight. How could he be expected to go on in life without the person who had completed him and made him who he was? Was there any amount of strength that could pull him from his despair? But Tina had one last gift to give, and that night she would make sure her husband would find the light he would need to lead him out of the dark. So again, that is the description of If I Could Have Lived Another Day by Jason Pellegrini. It is his newest novella, and there's some pretty heavy topics being addressed in this novella, and you may have listened to that description and thought, whew, that doesn't sound like the most interesting, or not interesting, but the most uplifting of reads. And yet it's not as dreary as it sounds. I know that sounds like a backhanded compliment, but Jason does a good job of weaving the story together in such a way that you get these pictures of Dan and Tina's life together as they find out about the diagnosis, but then as they go through the process and before Tina dies, you get a lot of flashbacks, you get a lot of backstory as to their relationship, and there's a lot of really lovely relationship moments in there, and there is it's ultimately a book of hope. It's a book of light in some of those darker places in our lives, and yeah, so it's not don't despair. It is not as dreary as you might think from that description. So, and Jason and I talk about that in the interview as well. So let's go ahead and turn now to that interview with Jason Pellegrini about his new novella, If I Could Have Lived Another Day. Hi, Jason. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me again.
Actually, this is your third time on the podcast. I think you're the first author to come back for a third time. So I don't know, you get a gold star or something.
Yeah, wow, thank you. I've always had a good time talking to you, so why not come back? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. You're welcome. Thanks for being here. We are here to talk about your new novella. But before we get to that, if you could share a little bit about yourself for the people who maybe haven't heard your previous interviews or need a refresher.
Well, I'm an independent author from Long Island, New York. My latest work, If I Could Have Lived Another Day, is my fourth release. That's really it. I mean, I can think of.
So as you mentioned, the new work is If I Had Lived Another Day. Can you give us a bit of a premise of the story?
Well, it's about a man who watches his wife, be diagnosed and go through, terminal cancer, and the coping of that, that experience from his perspective, I guess, and then him having to face, life without her once she's gone, and what that might mean for somebody who, she's now a widower.
Mm-hmm. A fairly young widower at that. What was your inspiration for this story?
So kind of like with the Cool Kids, where I had captioned a picture of my god kids, the Cool Kids, and I was like, that was a good name. I wonder what this story could be about. And then it spawned from there. It was the same thing with If I Could Have Lived Another Day. I remember walking through the bookstore and I was in my own little world, not even paying attention probably to what on the shelves. And that title just popped in my head. And I wanted it to be like a really short story about an elderly man finding a note from his wife after she had gone through cancer. I wanted it to be for like my website, offer for free. And then it morphed into something completely different, which ended up being the book. But the inspiration was, the title just came to me. I liked the way it sounded, and I'm like, all right, I want to use this title. Let me come up with a story idea, and I had one idea that turned into a completely different story. But it still, fit the title.
Right. Interesting. And in the dedication of the book, you dedicate it to, I think it's your cousin. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Was her story any part of the inspiration for this story, or did that come in any way?
No, my cousin was killed in an automobile accident. Nothing to do with cancer. But I like to think that it could tie in. This is a story more about losing somebody and finding closure in loss, not just from cancer, from anything. So I thought it was a fitting dedication.
Yeah, absolutely. The main character in the book, it's told from his perspective, is Dan. Can you talk a little bit about what about Dan is going to resonate with readers?
Well, I think he's very real. He in no way is a be strong for your wife. He is, but there's also parts where he's dealing with is the fact that the woman he loves is going to die, and there are parts in the story where he doesn't handle that well at all, because I feel like that's real. I feel like some stories like to paint, men like heroic, like, I'm going to be there, strong as can be for, the woman I love, and that's just not Dan. he's there, but at the same time he's being like torn apart. So I think the fact that he's very, very real, and his relationship I feel is very real.
Let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, Jason and I will be talking about the seemingly dreary nature of this story and how it really isn't dreary. Believe me, I promise you. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Jason Pellegrini about his new novella, If I Could Have Lived Another Day.
And listeners might be thinking, okay, this just sounds depressing. Why do I want to read this book? And I don't want to give away too much about the ending, but it's not as bleak as it seems. Can you talk a little bit about the brighter side of the book, the hope in the book?
Well, that that there's something maybe beyond, that maybe we all have a greater purpose and that things do happen for a reason. As depressed, as like I said, bleak as that may seem, like your wife dying of cancer, I believe she was 33. We find out that that it's for a reason, and that we all serve a greater purpose. Maybe if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like I said, I didn't want to give anything away toward the end.
It's hard to try to explain that without being, here's how the book ends.
Right.
So I was very proud of what I came up with at the end, because I didn't want to, because a lot of, whether it was beta readers or readers once it was out, they said because I like feedback as the people close to me are reading, and a lot of it was like, this is depressing, this is very sad. And at the end they were like, this is by far your best piece of work, that this is going to be great, which I don't think my work's great, but it's nice to hear other people say it.
Yeah, and you've got some really nice reviews on Amazon kind of saying the same things, how beautiful the story is, how honest the story is. And yeah, I mean, it is a little hard to talk about that it is. I'll just say it's worth it. Make it to the end. Don't let some of the harder parts of the book get to you, because it is worth it at the end. It's very satisfying, I guess, would be a non-spoilerly way to say that.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So how much research did you do for the book?
A lot. Luckily, I have a friend and a cousin who are working oncology, both nurses. And I have a friend who works in the ER. So I was able to piece together the whole process of, from the beginning of, headaches showing up to, a diagnosis, to treatment, to, what the end would be like for, a patient suffering from a brain tumor. So there was a lot that went into it. I wanted it to be as accurate as possible, because I didn't want to do anyone who've gotten through that or had a loved one go through that, any kind of, I guess injustice is maybe not the word I'm looking for, but I didn't want to write like a sham. I wanted to be an accurate, true portrayal of cancer and its ugliness.
Mhm. Mhm. And are there any autobiographical elements within the book or the characters besides the love of football?
Love of football. My Hemingway. I don't know. There's stuff like I honestly, when I found out For Whom the Bell Tolls was a Hemingway book, I was like, oh, I know it's a Metallica song, which is I think a reference to what the character makes in the book.
Yes.
I think everything we write is somewhat autobiographical because we're creating humans, and what better source to draw from when we're creating humans than yourself. I like to think him and his wife have a very back and forth, bantery kind of relationship from the minute they meet. They're playful kind of banter, and I like to think I'm a very sarcastic person, more times than I'm not, and I think that was a bit autobiographical. Just the things that go into the characters, nothing as far as the experiences go. Because I've personally never lost a loved one to cancer, so
Okay.
Which is shocks me that so many people like you say like I had to have gotten through this, and I just leave it be, but I haven't. I was just trying to convey like human emotion and how I think I would react if I was put in that situation.
Mhm.
I don't think you have to go through it in any way to know, to or at least not know, but at least have an idea of how that would feel to lose somebody so close to you at such a young stage of your life.
Right. Right. And excuse me if this is too personal of a question, but you're not married, correct?
I am not.
Okay. So I only ask because this is a story about a married couple, and so who were did you have role models for that relationship?
Just the relationship that I would always want to have. You know, I wanted to build what I think is a real relationship that has ups and and downs, and I just want I just want something to create something that felt real and something that I would personally want.
Okay. Thank you. What then do you hope that readers will take from this book?
I guess that maybe that it's not the end. If you lose somebody, that there is, we have to move forward. We have to move forward for them, because I can only imagine what it's like when your world crashes down around you, and you feel like the one person like you were meant to be with is gone. This is really a bleak conversation.
Well, it's a bleak topic, but
Yeah, no. Unfortunately, it's just no. I want to inspire hope, and like you said, at the end, I think I do that, and I think my character at the end, looks at the other side of things and feels, hope that he'll be able to go on, whether it's for himself or for his loved one. We have to carry on with their legacy because they're not here, to do that, so we have to do that for them. And I think letting a loved one's death destroy you would be the last thing anyone would want, meaning coming from the person who died. So I think we have to continue on and fight.
Let's go ahead and take our second break of the podcast. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and more of my interview with author Jason Pellegrini. Third time's a charm. It is his third visit to the podcast, and we are talking about his new novella, If I Could Have Lived Another Day.
And to interject here, so it does sound like we're having a very bleak conversation, and it's a very bleak book, but it's not just this sort of dirge, inevitable trudge towards this death. You work in the details of their relationship, so we get to know them as a couple, and we see the love that they have and the humor that they have. It's not just this whole like, oh my gosh, this woman is dying of cancer and everything is horrible. You do work in that relationship and the love that they have for their families and each other, and the life that happens around them.
Yeah, so there's this one scene where he's driving his wife. By the way, his wife's name is Tina. Dan is driving Tina to the emergency room, and I had originally written that scene. She had collapsed at home, and he took her to the emergency room, and then it just continued. And I felt like the story wasn't flowing right. My friend who was reading it didn't really feel like she said, this is just a bleak, depressing, you're just following this girl to her death. And then I had come up with, while he's driving her there, he has a flashback to a road trip they had taken. And I was, building them more. It wasn't just a woman dying of cancer and her husband, having to witness it, like him reliving that memory of, their road trip together, made them human, which was you're able to connect with them, and able to feel for their love, because I feel like in the beginning I hadn't been able to do that. But that's the process of writing. A lot of times you have like a bare bone idea and you get it on paper and you realize I need to fuck this up a little bit, or put some meat on the bone, so to speak.
Mhm. And I'll just give people fair warning: if you're not a fan of Bop, don't read that scene.
But nobody knows the words.
Nobody knows the words. I was singing it in my head, going, I have no idea what the words are.
I laughed when I put that line in, and I think my friend who was reading it too said she loved it, because nobody knows the words past Bop.
Exactly, but you have to sing them as loud as possible.
Yeah. But those are the little things that make the relationship, whether it's driving down the road and singing, belting out songs with your, I guess, fiance at the time. She was in the book. Some 90s pop that you begrudgingly don't want to admit, the words to. But, that's the little things. That's another thing I wanted to portray in the book. that, love isn't this grand thing. It's not one big act. It's a bunch of little things. I say in it, love is the sum of its parts. So all the little things combined, and I think that's what Dan and Tina, that's what they are or were. They were just your normal couple that fall in love and have a great, working relationship.
Mhm. Mhm. What are you working on now? I'm always nosy about the next thing.
So I was working on a novel that I was kind of getting burned out on because it's might be close to 1,000 pages by the time it's done.
Wow.
So I kind of had hit a mental roadblock with it where I was, got 400 pages and I'm like thinking about the future, and I'm like, I didn't even cover this or that or this. So I was like, I gotta step away, and that's when I wrote If I Could Have Lived Another Day. So I'd gone back to that, and I'm still facing the fact that I am maybe not even at the halfway mark yet. I'm almost 500 pages in, but I'm currently working on that because that is the story. I'm really proud of what I have. It's just I have to get there, and knowing that it's going to be a journey. And then there's the whole rewrites and edits and talking about now. I'm like, why am I doing this to myself?
Might it be a series? I mean, is that something that would be possible?
No, it's just the fact that there's two different timelines in it. Like what the plot line that takes part in the present, and a lot of my main character's lineage plays into the story, so I have to cover all that, and I go back almost over 100 years. So I have to cover 100 years worth of generation.
Wow, yeah, that would be a lot to fit in. When you write, you tend to have some, like in Booth there was time travel. In The Cool Kids there was kind of a fantasy element, but you also tend to write across genres in some ways. And so is that something that you prefer to do, or is it just the way the stories come to you and you write them as they come?
I just write them as they come. I don't want to be pigeonholed to one genre, because then I feel like people expect me to write one genre, and I think when you're writing just one particular type of story, you're going to run out of ideas and then force out things that aren't good. So if I like a horror idea, I'll write a horror idea, which I have plenty of those in my head. If I want to write a tragic, story of loss, I'll write that, which I did, and it's just so whatever pops in my head. I mean, my biggest influence is Stephen King, hence me writing a 1,000-page book. But he writes. I mean, he's known as a horror writer, but he writes so many different genres, and I'm glad that he's my favorite author, because I can see that, I shouldn't have to worry about appeasing one group or thinking that only one kind of story will attract people to my writing, because I don't think that. I think Booth is as strong as If I Could Have Lived Another Day, just in very different ways.
Okay, thank you for that. And you mentioned Stephen King, which made me remember a scene very early on in the book. Dan is in a college class, and there is another student in that class who is very, very vociferous about not liking Stephen King. Was that? I mean, just what was your what brought that scene on?
I read a book called, I don't remember what it was called, but it was a bunch of articles about Stephen King that people had written over time, and one of them was from a college professor who, it was from an author who, while he was in college, professor went on this rant about how Stephen King isn't, real true literature. And you hear that a lot. I mean, even Stephen King himself has, gone on how people say, like, he's not a real, he's not a real author or a literary author, at least. So that was just, in my head when I wrote that scene. Because Dan, who knows nothing of literature, the only author he knows is Stephen King because he's Stephen King. And then, that popped in my head, that thing about, people thinking that he's not a real literary author. So I just wanted to include it. But nobody, actually, you know what? I have met people who mock King.
It just kind of made me laugh because I know that you are a Stephen King fan. I follow you on social media and I've seen some of your posts and everything, and we've talked about it before. So I was like, there's something there.
Oh no, I think King can be very literary. And can be very deep. I don't think he's all people just because he writes bump in the night kind of stuff, or he can be very grotesque, with his writing.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean he's not, can't write beautiful things.
Right.
Let's go ahead and take our last break of the podcast, but I do have to say, maybe you've had a similar experience where you follow someone on social media, or in my case, you've spoken to them briefly a couple of times, 3 times in this case, and so you're like, yeah, I know something about this guy. So, very little something, and I know from his social media that he likes Stephen King. So what's up with this scene? Well, I actually sometimes get to ask those questions, and that is a pretty cool aspect of my job as a podcast host. I know, I ask some random questions sometimes, but I get to, so I am pretty happy about that. Let's get to that last break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit about what Jason has been reading. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media. From Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with Jason Pellegrini. We are talking about his new novella, If I Could Have Lived Another Day.
So speaking of Stephen King and authors, what have you been reading since we last chatted?
Not as much as I'd like to. But I currently am reading A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay, I think it is. I might have massacred his last name. I've also discovered my love for audiobooks. So right now I'm currently listening to East of Eden by Steinbeck, who is another one of my favorites. Steinbeck is, you talk about brilliant authors. He's freaking, the way he writes just is non-comparative. You can't compare. But I'm revisiting a lot on Audible because there's too many books to read, to revisit books. So I've been doing that on Audible. Other than that, I try to read, whatever. I think I read Wanderers by Chuck Wendig recently. I've been buying a lot of classics. Whether or not I get to reading them is a different story, but I want to try to revisit a lot of classics that we had to read in school because I didn't pay attention to them when I should have been. I wasn't a very good student.
I'm actually doing something similar. I'm reading things that I feel like I should have been assigned in school, and wasn't. So
Well, that's fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I seem to be buying. I've got to the point where I'm like, I'm buying too many books and I'm not reading enough. But unfortunately, life gets in the way sometimes, and I come home and I read like 2 pages, and I wake up with the book on the floor, and I'm on the couch, falling asleep somehow.
Yep, I totally understand that. Here's my random question for you. I do follow you on social media, and you post a lot of pictures of both books and the Funko Pop characters. How many of those do you have?
I believe I've recently passed the 250 mark.
Wow.
That's
That
nothing
is
compared to some people.
Oh no, I'm sure. I'm just impressed. That is it's still an impressive collection.
I think so. It goes nice. I recently moved, so my second bedroom, which is going to be my library / office, was like in complete and utter disarray. So finally, I've gotten around to like putting up the shelves and putting the books on the bookshelves and the pops up. And I love the way it looks. With I got my Buffy pops with my Buffy books. You know, there's a bunch of Stephen King pops that will go with my Stephen Kings. I got Pinhead for like Clive Barker. You know, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So
I like
they
it.
complement the books a lot.
Yeah. So, as I keep mentioning about social media, you are on social media. So tell people where they can find you on social media, and if you have a website where they can find that, if they want to be able to interact with you a little more.
Well, you can find me on Twitter at J Pellegrini 1983. J just the letter, not Jay. I'm also on Instagram at Jason Pellegrini Books. Same with Facebook. And my website is www.jasonpellegrinibooks.com. You can order books there, in which you would receive them signed. And that's really it.
All right, and if people want to check out your fabulous collection of books and Funko Pops, they can go to your social media, and because you take fun pictures too, so that is fun.
I also started just started a Funko page called JP Collects Pops. It's
Nice.
a startup, but I have so many of them. I'm like, I might as well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So, Jason, we've talked about the new novella. We've talked about, a variety of different topics. But is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to bring up during our time together?
No. I mean, is there anything else? There's always. I feel like this conversation was a little more on the bleak side, unfortunately, because of the. Yeah, it's never fun talking about cancer, but like you said, it is a book of hope, and I want to reiterate that because it's something I'm very proud of, and I've been getting such amazing feedback. I didn't think of the 4 of my books that it was going to get the feedback that it's got the highest rating on Goodreads. So. I didn't expect to get this kind of reaction, which is very nice because I guess I always like hearing good things about me.
That's always nice, yeah, better than the opposite. So, well, thank you so much. The book is out now. You can order it, and like you said, you can go to your website and have it personalized if you want to go that route. So, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you once again to Jason for joining me to talk about this new novella. It really is, he weaves it together so beautifully, and I know it's got some heavy topics to it, but I very much enjoyed reading it. It's a quick read. It's a novella. It's only about 150 pages, and so you get this glimpse into this couple's lives, and it might at times feel a little heavy, but it won't leave you feeling heavy. It will leave you maybe with some questions, maybe with some insight, but it will not leave you feeling heavy. So definitely check it out, especially if you have read his other books. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. I so very much appreciate you. I hope that you will join me again on Friday, when I'm going to be talking about some books that I'm kind of embarrassed to admit that I've never read before this point in my life. And you'll just have to tune in to find out what those are. So join me on Friday. In the meantime, hope you've had a little bit of spring weather wherever you are, but I hope even more that regardless of the weather, you have plenty of time this week to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.